He appeared from the heat, a ghost walking out of a shimmering mirage. The Midwestern sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth, but the man didn't seem to notice. He was barefoot. He was shirtless. His feet left bloody prints in the gravel, a story of a long and painful journey. Dust clung to his broad, sun-scorched back in streaks, like a guilt that refused to be washed away. He carried a silence so heavy you could almost see it weighing down his shoulders. Flies buzzed at the corners of his eyes, but he never blinked. He was walking toward the Thornhill Ranch, a place that sat proud and white on the plains, too grand for a widow, or so the town whispered. He didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He had nothing to offer but the broken pieces of himself, and he knew even that might be too much. He just kept walking, boots tied to his hip with a piece of twine, his gaze fixed on the house. From an upstairs window, behind a gauzy curtain, she watched him come. Evangeline Thornhill, a woman drowning in a black dress she hadn't taken off since the day she buried her baby. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, a shield against a world that had already taken everything. Her eyes narrowed. She knew who he was. Not by name, but by kind. Apache. A man whose people had been scattered by the wind. A man who looked like he was halfway through being erased from the earth. He was tall, built in a way that disturbed the neat, orderly lines of her garden. He looked like a storm cloud on the edge of her very quiet, very empty horizon. She went to the porch, a rifle in her hand. It wasn't raised, not yet, but it was there, a clear and simple message. He didn't slow his pace. He walked right up to the bottom step of her porch, looked at the dust on his own bleeding feet, and dropped the small sack he carried. It landed with the soft, sad sound of cloth and cornmeal. Then, he did something she never expected. He knelt. Right there in the dirt and the gravel, he knelt before her. His voice, when it finally came, was cracked and raw from thirst. "I ain't here to steal," he rasped. "Ain't here to beg, either." He looked up then, and his eyes held hers. They were brown and soft, and filled with a pain so ancient it felt like it belonged to the land itself. "Let me work," he said. "Let me earn my keep. I'll mend your fences. I'll guard your cattle." He paused, and the next words dropped between them like stones into a deep, silent well. "I'll even get you pregnant again if that's what the town wants." The air went still. The wind held its breath. Evangeline's jaw twitched, but her grip on the rifle didn't change. That last sentence hung in the air, brutal and shocking. What kind of man says something like that? "Did someone send you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Then why here? Why my ranch?" He looked past her, at the big empty house, at the silent windows, at the ghost of a life that used to be lived there. "Because you look lonelier than me," he said. And in that moment, she saw it all. The deep, jagged scar along his collarbone, the single blue bead braided into his dark, long hair. She saw a man who had been stripped of everything except the ability to kneel, everything except the truth in his eyes. The town would talk, the town would judge. She knew that. But as the porch curtain lifted in the breeze like a passing spirit, she made a decision that would change everything. "Sleep in the barn," she said, and turned her back on him, walking back into the silence of her home. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. That very night, the poison started to spread. Mrs. Almina Graves, a woman whose nose was longer than the road she lived on, just happened to be passing by with her mule cart. She lived a mile away, but she never missed a thing. And what she saw made her eyes go wide with wicked delight. She saw the figure of a man by the water pump, shirtless, the moonlight catching the ripple of his muscles as he washed himself in a tin basin. He looked like a statue carved out of the dusk, a pagan god come to life in the widow Thornhill's yard. By morning, the whispers were traveling faster than a prairie fire. Sheriff Boone Avery stopped by just after noon, He was a good man, but a tired one. He leaned on the porch railing, his hat tipped low, his boots coated in the dust of other people's problems. "Evangeline," he said, and her name sounded like a question. "He hasn't touched a thing that isn't broken," she replied, her voice flat. She knew why he was there. Boone nodded slowly, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "That's not what folks are worried about, and you know it." "I'm not folks," she shot back. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. He glanced toward the barn, where the man was already at work, mending a cracked wagon wheel. He moved with a quiet efficiency, like someone whose body remembered being useful even if his soul had forgotten why. He hadn't asked where the tools were, he just found them. He hadn't asked what needed fixing, he just saw it. "What's his name?" Boone asked. "I didn't ask," she said. "Want me to send him on his way? Say the word, and it's done." Evangeline looked toward the barn. She saw the steady rise and fall of his shoulders. She saw the sag in the fence line he was already walking toward, his next task already chosen. She thought of the deafening silence of her house, a silence he had somehow managed to disturb without making a sound. "No," she said. The sheriff nodded again, a strange look in his eyes. It wasn't just concern, it was something else. Something like guilt. "All right, Evangeline," he said, tipping his hat. "Then I'll let him stay, at least until they sharpen their tongues into knives." He left, and Evangeline was alone again. That evening she brought the man a cup of water. He took it without a word, just a nod of his head. But she noticed how he looked at her hands. Not with lust, like other men did. He looked at them with a strange intensity, as if he could read the story of her life in the scars on her knuckles, in the way her fingers trembled only when they were perfectly still. She almost said something. She almost asked his name, but the words caught in her throat. Later that night, she sat by her bedroom window, the one that looked out over the barn. She was holding a tiny baby bonnet, one made of lace she'd never quite learned how to sew right. And in the deep, profound quiet of the prairie, she heard it. A sound drifted from the barn. He was singing, a low, broken lullaby in a language that didn't belong on these flat plains. It was a song of such deep sorrow that it felt like the earth itself was crying. She quickly stood up and slammed the window shut, as if the sound itself could burn her. But it was too late. The melody was already inside her, and it raised a terrifying question. How could a complete stranger know a lullaby that sounded so much like the one she used to hum to the child she'd lost? In town, the venom was brewing. Mrs. Graves had gathered her circle of crows outside the chapel, their black dresses like funeral shrouds. "It's indecent," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. A widow, taking in a savage right after what happened to her dear husband. What kind of message does that send to our good Christian community? Another woman, her face pinched and cruel, leaned in and murmured, "Maybe she wants another child, one that'll live this time." The laughter that followed was quiet, but it was ugly. It was the kind of laughter that leaves scars. Back at the ranch, the silence between Evangeline and the man stretched for 2 more days. He worked. She watched. He fixed the gate, weeded her dead garden, swept the barn until it smelled of pine. He was slowly, methodically, repairing the broken pieces of her world. On the 3rd day, she found a small handful of desert flowers on her doorstep. They weren't arranged in a fancy bouquet. They were just gathered. Dusty, raw, and real. She accidentally stepped on them as she walked out the door. But then she paused. She bent down, picked one crushed blossom up, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. That night, she heard him whisper a name into the darkness of the barn. Ashki. She didn't know what it meant, but she found herself whispering it back to the empty rooms of her house, like a secret she didn't understand, but felt compelled to keep. By the end of the week, the ranch looked different. The fence stood straight and true. The garden was clean. The barn was a sanctuary of order. But he had asked for nothing more than shade and water. He was giving everything and taking nothing. until the day he collapsed. She found him face down near the cattle trough. Heat stroke. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He'd poured all of his strength into her land, leaving none for himself. With a surge of adrenaline she didn't know she possessed, she dragged his heavy frame inside, onto her parlor rug. He was burning with fever, sweat streaking his brow. She pressed a cold cloth to his chest and a single frustrated word escaped her lips. "You fool!" His eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain. "Better to die working," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "than waiting." Waiting? Waiting for what? The question hammered in her mind. She didn't argue. She brought him broth, spooning it into his mouth like he was a child. She let him sleep there, on her own floor, near the old piano she hadn't touched since the baby, since everything. That night, she didn't close her window. She left it wide open, letting the cool night air wash over her. And of course, Mrs. Graves passed by on her nightly patrol. But this time, she saw more than just a shirtless Apache by the pump. She saw him through the window, inside the house. And she saw Evangeline standing in the doorway of the parlor, not wearing her widow's black. For the first time in a long, long time, Mrs. Graves didn't say a word. She just stared, her mind racing, connecting dots that weren't there, inventing sins that hadn't been committed. She turned her mule cart around and headed back to town, a new, more dangerous story already forming on her lips. Back in the house, in the moonlight-drenched quiet, Evangeline Thornhill looked at the sleeping man on her floor. He looked younger in sleep, the deep lines of pain on his face softened. She whispered a single word to the room that had once held a child, a word that was both a plea and a command. "Stay." But she had no idea what she was truly inviting into her life, because the man on her floor wasn't just a wanderer, he had a purpose, and his arrival at her ranch was no accident. It was the first move in a game of revenge that would tear the whole town apart. He rose before the sun, before the first rooster crowed. The morning was cool and amber, the dew like scattered diamonds on the porch rail. He was Tala Redhawk, though she didn't know his name yet. He stretched beneath the barn rafters, his muscles waking slowly from a sleep on a bed of hay. He never approached the house in the morning. He kept his distance. Each day he'd gather the tools, sharpen the axe on a flat stone, and find something broken to fix. The squeaky well handle, the porch board she always stepped over. He worked as if penance was a muscle, a thing you had to exercise every single day to keep it from wasting away. From her kitchen window, Evangeline would watch him, one hand stirring her coffee, the other resting on her flat stomach, a place where life would never grow again. She watched the way he moved, with a deliberate, unhurried grace. Each swing of the hammer seemed to hold back a ghost. Sometimes, she'd catch herself breathing in time with him. Inhale on the lift, exhale on the strike. She hated herself for it. She told herself he was just a useful body, a pair of hands that didn't ask questions. But a deeper, quieter part of her knew that wasn't true. He never stared at her. Not in the way men did, with hunger or pity in their eyes. He looked past her, at the land, at the horizon, as if he was afraid she would mistake his attention for something else. And she noticed that too. It was a kind of respect she hadn't known in a long, long time. It was, of course, Mrs. Graves who shattered the fragile peace. She arrived late one afternoon, her face pinched like a sour apple. She was clutching a bundle of folded quilts, a supposed peace offering that felt more like a weapon. "Thought you might need these," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She stood on the porch, refusing to come closer. "Appreciated," Evangeline said, her voice cool. "I hear you have a man working the place," Mrs. Graves continued, her eyes darting toward the barn. "He's fixing the fence. I hope that's all he's fixing." The words cracked through the air like a whip. Evangeline's eyes turned to ice. "I don't recall asking for your advice, Elmina." Mrs. Graves simply smiled, a thin reptilian stretching of her lips. "Just remember, dear, the town's eyes are always watching, and they see everything. She left the quilts on the porch swing. That night, Evangeline took them to the fire pit in the back and burned them. She watched the flames lick at the fabric, turning the thoughtful patterns to black ash. Tala saw the smoke. He saw the fire, but he never asked what it was for. The next day, he left a gift for her on the back step. It was a mason jar, half full of wild honey, the color of dark gold. It was sticky and messy, wrapped in a piece of clean linen. He placed it there at dusk and walked away without a sound. She didn't touch it for 3 days. She was afraid of it, afraid of what it meant. But when she finally unscrewed the lid, her fingers trembling, she saw it. Lying at the bottom, submerged in the thick, golden honey, was a single, perfect cedar needle. She knew what that meant. In his culture, it was a symbol of protection, of cleansing, of strength. This wasn't just a gift of honey, it was a promise. He was telling her, in his own silent language, that he would protect her from the poison of the town. That night she found herself drawn to the barn. She stood in the shadows, watching him skin a rabbit for his dinner. He moved with a kind of reverence, his hands sure and careful. The moonlight cast his body in silver, making him look like something ancient, carved from the earth itself. She looked away before he could see her, her heart pounding in her chest. But she had a feeling he already knew she was there. The next morning, 3 rabbits, skinned and cleaned, were waiting for her in the cold box behind the barn. No note, no explanation, just a quiet offering. She roasted one for her supper and ate it alone in her silent dining room. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt shared. When the rain came, it came with a vengeance. Thunder rattled the windows like angry fists, and the sky cracked open, unleashing a torrent. Tala didn't run for shelter. He stood out in the middle of the deluge, shirtless, his long hair plastered to his skin, his arms outstretched as if he were embracing the storm. She watched him from the porch, and for a split second, an image flashed in her mind. The image of a child with his brown skin and her eyes, running wild and barefoot and bold in the rain. The image shook her to her core. On impulse, she grabbed an oilskin coat from the hook by the door, stepped off the porch, and walked into the storm. The rain soaked her thin dress in seconds, but she didn't care. She walked right up to him and pressed the bundle into his hands. "Keep dry," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. He just nodded. "Thank you." But he didn't go inside the barn. He sat under the overhang, the coat draped over his shoulders, and just watched the storm, as if he was a part of it. Evangeline returned to her house, shivering, but not from the cold. The house felt emptier now than it ever had before. She went to her wardrobe and stared at the row of black dresses hanging there like ghosts. One by one, she took them down. She carried them to the stove, stuffed them inside, and lit a match. The fire burned hot and clean. Later that night, wearing a simple cotton shift, she stepped back out onto the porch. The wind curled around her bare ankles. She looked toward the barn, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was gone. The place where he usually slept was empty. Then she saw him. He was sitting near the open barn door, a lantern at his feet, whittling a small piece of wood. She didn't call out to him. She just stood there in the darkness, listening to the soft scrape of the knife against the wood, a sound that was infinitely more comforting than the silence she had lived in for so long. The next morning, another object was on her porch. It was the carving from the night before, a small wooden figure of a woman, standing barefoot. Her hand was held out, not reaching for something, just open, ready to receive. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat from his hands. And she whispered something to the morning air, not even knowing why she said it. "Stay close," she whispered. But not too close. The wind didn't answer, but somehow she knew he'd heard her, and she knew that the careful distance between them was about to shrink, Because the carving wasn't just a carving, it was an invitation, and the thing he was carving next would change both of their lives forever. The day of the harvest festival arrived, painting the town in false cheer. Banners made of scrap cotton swayed between the buildings. Children with molasses-sticky mouths ran through the square, their laughter lifting like smoke. It was a performance of happiness, and Evangeline knew all the lines. She stood at the edge of the square, a ghost at the feast. She wore a cream-colored cotton dress with tiny blue flowers, the first non-black item she'd worn in public in over a year. It felt like wearing a target. The whispers followed her, thorns brushing against her skin. Look, she finally crawled out of her cave. Guess she's ready for another try at being a wife. That Apache probably picked that dress out for her. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. She just kept her arms wrapped around her waist, holding herself together. Tala was there, but not with her. He stayed back, near the corrals, a silent shadow in the chaos of the festival. He wasn't her escort. He was her guardian. He watched her move through the crowd, his eyes missing nothing. She bought 2 slices of apple pie, ate one, and left the other on the plate, a small, lonely monument to a life that was supposed to be shared. Then the dancing started. Fiddles wailed and boots stomped in the dirt. Evangeline stared, her eyes distant, seeing a version of herself from another life, one where she was laughing and spinning and alive. The memory shattered when a man stumbled into her, Clem Garver, a local rancher twice widowed, with a reputation for cruelty that was an open secret. He was drunk, his breath sour. "Evening, Mrs. Thornhill," he slurred, a greasy smile on his face. "You're looking mighty fine tonight. Mighty fine indeed." She tried to step back, but he moved with her. "Bet you're getting lonely out there on that big ranch all by yourself. I'd be happy to oblige you with some company." Before she could react, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron, and then Tala was there. He hadn't made a sound. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hands. He simply materialized between them, as solid and immovable as an ancient oak tree. Clem's hand dropped from her wrist as if it had been burned. His eyes narrowed into slits. "What's this? You letting this savage speak for you now, Evangeline?" Tala didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on some point in the distance. "She doesn't need to answer you," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge of steel that cut through the drunken haze. The music faltered. Conversations died. The entire town square seemed to hold its breath. In that sudden, deafening silence, all eyes were on them. "Let's go," Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling. Tala turned his back on Clem Garver and walked beside her, parting the crowd like a ship through water. They walked away from the festival, away from the prying eyes and the poisoned whispers, and didn't stop until they reached the quiet steps of the empty chapel. She leaned against the railing, trying to catch her breath, her hands shaking. Tala waited a respectful distance away, giving her space, giving her silence. When she finally opened her eyes, the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "I didn't come for them," he answered, his voice equally quiet. She turned and really looked at him then, not as a worker, not as a mystery, but as a man. A man who had just defended her honor without laying a hand on anyone. "I don't need saving," she said, the words a lie she had told herself for a year. "I know," he said. "I didn't come to save you." "Then why?" she asked, the question hanging between them, fragile and real. "Why are you here?" He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it in the palm of his hand. It was a small corn husk doll, simple and roughly made. But around its tiny waist was a single piece of blue thread, the same color as the bead in his hair. "She would have been 4 today," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that mirrored her own. Evangeline's throat closed up. She couldn't breathe. 4. Her baby. Her Lily. He gently placed the doll on the step between them. I don't want to make you a mother again, he said, his eyes meeting hers, holding a universe of pain and understanding. I wanted you to have her, even just for one day. With a shaking hand, she reached for the doll. It was so light, so fragile. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a living thing. A sob escaped her lips, the first one she had allowed herself in a year. I never told you her name, she whispered through her tears. I never told anyone. You didn't have to, he said softly. The world fell away. The festival, the town, the whispers. None of it mattered. There was only this man, this doll, and a shared grief so profound it felt like a physical bond. How? She finally managed to ask. How did you know? Tala looked away, toward the dark road that led back to her ranch. The road he had walked down, barefoot and broken. Because I was there, he said, his voice barely audible. I was there the day she died. The confession landed like a lightning strike, cracking her world open all over again. What do you mean, you were there? She demanded, her voice a raw whisper. The corn-husk doll felt heavy in her hand, no longer a comfort but a piece of a puzzle she was terrified to solve. They stood in the deepening twilight, the distant sounds of the festival a mocking counterpoint to the gravity of the moment. My family, Tala began, his voice strained. We had a homestead, a few miles from here, on the other side of the creek. He paused, gathering himself. Your husband, he wasn't a good man, Evangeline. The words were a slap. She wanted to deny them, to defend the memory of the man she had married, but a cold knot of truth tightened in her stomach. She had always known, hadn't she? Deep down. He and some other men from town, Tala continued, his eyes dark with memory. Clem Garver, and Jedediah Thorne, the one who owns the bank. They wanted our land. The creek made it valuable. They tried to run us off, threatened us. He looked at her, his gaze pleading for her to understand. We wouldn't leave. It was our home. So they came back, one afternoon. They said there was an accident at your ranch, that your husband needed help. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face. The story the town told was that her husband John had been killed in a cattle stampede. A tragic accident. It wasn't a stampede, Tala said, his voice flat and dead. It was a fight. My brother stood up to them. Your husband, he pulled a gun. He took a shaky breath. Someone knocked the gun away. It went off. John, he fell. It was chaos. Thorne and Garver, they panicked. They knew they'd be ruined if the truth came out. So they made up a story, Evangeline breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The stampede. Yes, Tala confirmed. But Lily, your daughter, she was with him, in the wagon. While they were arguing, while they were creating their lies, no one was watching her. The sun was hot. Too hot. By the time they found them hours later, he didn't have to finish. Evangeline sank onto the chapel steps, a wave of nausea washing over her. Her daughter hadn't died in a tragic accident. She had died from neglect, abandoned in the heat by men consumed with their own greed and cowardice. Her grief, a quiet, sorrowful thing for so long, began to curdle into a hot, burning rage. But that's not all, Tala said, and his voice broke. To cover their tracks completely, to make sure my family couldn't talk. That night, they came back to our homestead. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. They set a fire. Oh God, Evangeline whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. I was in town, trying to get supplies, he said, his body trembling with the memory. When I got back, it was all gone. My brother, his wife. He choked on the words. And my daughter, Ashki, the doll. The doll is for her too. Now she understood. The shared lullaby, the ancient pain in his eyes. Their grief was not just similar. It was born from the same fire, the same men, the same sin. He hadn't come to her ranch as a wanderer. He had come as a witness. He had come for justice. He knelt before her again, just as he had on that first day. But this time, she understood. It was not an act of submission. It was an offer of an alliance. "Thorn wants your land, Evangeline," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "It was the last piece he needed to control the whole valley. That's why they're pushing you. That's why they want you gone. They think you're a weak, grieving widow they can scare away." She looked at him, at this man who had lost everything, who had come to her with nothing but the truth. And in that moment, the woman who had hidden from the world for a year died. A new woman was born in her place, one forged in fury. "They're wrong," she said, her voice like flint. She stood up, pulling him to his feet. "They think I'm weak?" She looked down the dark road toward the town that had judged her, lied to her, and allowed her child to die. "They haven't seen weak yet." They walked back to the ranch not as a widow and a handyman, but as two soldiers preparing for war. The silence between them was no longer about grief. It was about strategy. Every step was a vow. Every breath was a promise of retribution. They were no longer two broken people. They were a single, sharpened weapon aimed directly at the heart of the town. The next morning, the war began with a splash of red paint. Smeared across the clean white door of the barn, in cruel, dripping letters, was a single, ugly phrase: "Savage's whore." Tala stood before it, his arms folded, his face a mask of cold fury. Evangeline came and stood beside him, her expression unreadable. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message from Jedediah Thorne and Clem Garver. A warning: "We know you're getting close to the truth. Back off." "I'll paint over it," Tala offered, his voice tight. "No," Evangeline said, a strange, hard smile playing on her lips. She turned and walked back to the house, returning minutes later with a bucket of whitewash and 2 brushes. "We'll do it together," she said. They covered the hateful words, stroke by methodical stroke. It wasn't about hiding the ugliness. It was about erasing it. It was a silent declaration that they would not be intimidated. With every layer of fresh white paint, they were fortifying their defenses, preparing for the battle to come. That evening, Sheriff Boone Avery paid another visit. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a deep, weary guilt. "They won't stop, Evangeline," he said. "Not unless you make him leave." "This is my home, Boone," she replied, her voice firm. The sheriff glanced at Tala, who stood a few paces away, whittling a piece of wood with intense focus. "I know," Boone said, his voice dropping, "but they'll make sure you burn in it." He took a deep breath and finally confessed the secret he'd been carrying for a year. "I knew the story about the stampede was a lie," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "I saw the tracks. I saw the signs of a fight. But Thorne, he owns this town. He owns me. He threatened my family. He told me to rule it an accident, and I was a coward. I did what he said." Evangeline's heart hardened, but she didn't lash out. She needed him. "So you're just going to let him get away with it?" "No," Boone said, a flicker of defiance in his tired eyes. "I'm not. I can't arrest him without proof, without a witness who will speak on the record. But I can warn you, he's gathering men. He's using the church, twisting scripture, telling everyone you've gone mad with grief and fallen into sin with a heathen. He's planning to run you off your land for good," Boone finished. "He's coming for you, at dawn." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell. The night was still, but it felt like the calm before a hurricane. Evangeline turned to Tala. "Why?" she asked. "Why haven't you left? You could have been 100 miles from here by now." He set down his piece of wood. The carving was a hawk, its wings spread for flight. "Because you never asked me to," he said simply. Her breath caught. "Would you have gone, if I had?" "No," he said, meeting her gaze. "Why not?" He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land he had so carefully tended. "Because every time I fix something that's broken here," he said, his voice rough with emotion, I feel a little less broken myself. That night, she didn't just let him sleep by the fire. She went into her dining room and lit 2 candles, placing them on the table. When she sat down for her meager supper, he wordlessly took the seat across from her. Not as a guest, not as a worker, as an equal. They ate in silence, but it was a silence charged with purpose, a peace forged in the face of a coming storm. Later she found him outside again, finishing the carving of the hawk. She sat beside him on the porch steps, their shoulders almost touching. "Do you believe in starting over?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight from the window. "I believe in trying," he answered. She nodded slowly. "So do I." After he had gone inside to his pallet by the fire, she stood in her bedroom for a long time. She looked at her large, empty bed. Then, with a steady hand, she walked to the linen closet, took out a second pillow, and placed it next to her own. It wasn't an invitation to passion, not yet. It was a statement. We faced the dawn together. As she lay in bed, staring into the darkness, she listened to the sound of his breathing from the room below. It was the sound of an ally, the sound of hope. And for the first time in a year, Evangeline Thornhill wasn't afraid of the morning. She was ready for it. The dawn broke quiet and pale, a liar's dawn. The air was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. Evangeline stood on the porch, barefoot in her simple cotton dress. Her hand rested on the railing, steady and sure. Tala was by the barn, not splitting wood today. He stood still and shirtless, a sentinel watching the horizon. He felt them coming, just as she did. They arrived not with a roar, but with the squeak of wagon wheels. 3 wagons, 7 men, and at their head, the woman from the church, Almina Graves, clutching a Bible like a weapon. Leading them all was Jedediah Thorne, his beige suit ridiculously clean, his face a mask of pious authority. They halted at the gate. "Mrs. Thornhill," Thorne called out, his voice syrupy and false. She didn't answer. She just walked slowly down the porch steps, her gaze as cold and hard as river stone. Tala moved to stand beside her, his body loose but ready, an old oak tree that refused to be bent by any storm. "We've had complaints, madam," Thorne said, his smile thin. "Concerns about unbecoming conduct. You've ignored the chapel's guidance and now this arrangement." "Say what you mean, Jedediah," Evangeline snapped, her voice cutting through his pretense. His smile vanished. "You have allowed a savage to share your home, your land. We can only assume you share your bed as well." "He sleeps on a quilt," she shot back. "Not a throne, though he's more of a king than you'll ever be." Almina Graves stepped forward, her face pinched with self-righteousness. "This is a town of morals, Evangeline, of scripture and decency." "This is a town of rot," Evangeline replied, her voice ringing with newfound power. "And you've mistaken your stench for righteousness." Thorne's jaw clenched. He was losing control. "We have the authority from the town council to seize this property, as it is being used in ways that dishonor this community." "Then take it," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. The men behind him murmured, confused. "Take the house," she continued, stepping forward. "Take the land, take the barn, burn it all to the ground." She locked her eyes on his. "But you will not take him." "You would cast yourself out? For him?" Thorne sputtered, incredulous. "I already did," she said. "The moment I chose to live in truth, instead of the lies you all feed on. The moment I let this good man fix all the things that you and your kind broke." Tala's voice, when it came, was like thunder wrapped in silk. "You don't have to fight for me, Evangeline." She didn't look at him, but her voice softened. "I'm not fighting for you, Tala. I'm fighting for the woman I thought I buried with my child." She turned her fiery gaze back to Thorne. "Now, get off my land." Thorne, his face purple with rage, gave a sharp nod to one of his men. "Take her!" The man, Clem Garver, stepped forward, his hand reaching for her arm. He never touched her. Tala moved. It wasn't fast. It was something else, a force of nature. He stepped between them, his eyes blazing with a fire that had been banked for a year. He had no weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was enough to make the gun on Clem's hip feel like a child's toy. Tala looked directly at Jedediah Thorne. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the yard, clear and damning. "I buried a child once because of you," he said. "I will not bury her." The world froze. The men stopped. Almina Graves gasped. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and horrifying, and in that moment of shocked silence, another sound was heard. The sound of a horse, approaching at a slow, deliberate walk. Sheriff Boone Avery rode into the yard alone, but he wasn't the same tired, defeated man. He sat tall in the saddle, and his eyes were clear. He dismounted with a purpose he hadn't shown in years, and came to stand on the other side of Evangeline. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Jedediah," the sheriff said, his voice calm and steady. "You swore to uphold the law, Sheriff," Thorne hissed. "The council's law. I swore to uphold peace," Boone corrected him. "And I see more of it right here between these two people than I've seen in your church in 10 years. He looked past Thorne, at the men gathered behind him. "And I also swore to uphold justice. Jedediah Thorne, you and Clem Garver are under arrest." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. "For what?" Thorne shrieked. "This is madness!" The sheriff's gaze was like ice. "For the murder of John Thornhill, and for the arson and murders at the Red Hawk homestead." He looked directly at Tala. "I have a witness." It was over. The power Thorne had wielded for so long, built on lies and fear, crumbled to dust in a single moment. The men he had brought with him backed away, their faces pale. Almina Graves looked like she had seen a ghost, her Bible slipping from her nerveless fingers. As the sheriff led a sputtering, defeated Thorne and a trembling Garver away in handcuffs, he tipped his hat to Evangeline. "I always knew you were stronger than your husband," he said. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. He never knew what to do with silence. Boone looked at Tala, a deep respect in his eyes. "And you?" "I stay," Tala said. "Good," the sheriff replied, nodding once. That's all she ever needed. He rode off, leaving them in the sudden, peaceful quiet of the morning. The dust settled. The villains were gone. Later, as the sun climbed high in the sky, they sat together on the porch steps. For the first time, their shoulders touched. The space between them was finally gone. "You could leave now," she said softly, looking out at the land that was truly hers again. "You're not bound here. Your justice is done." "I was never bound," he answered, his voice quiet. "I chose to kneel, and I'll choose to stay." She turned to him, her eyes shining with tears she no longer needed to hide. Her voice was small, but full of a world of hope. "Then I'll ask you for something." His dark eyes met hers, waiting. "Stay," she whispered. He nodded, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face. And he whispered a single word back, a promise that was stronger than any fence, more solid than any foundation. Always. That night, they lay together under the quilt he had slept on for so long. Not as strangers, not as allies, but as survivors who had found a home in each other's broken pieces. She placed his calloused, scarred hand over her heart, and he closed his eyes, finally feeling the peace he had been searching for. The house, once filled with the echoes of grief, was now filled with the quiet, steady sound of two hearts beating as one. They hadn't just found love. They had forged it from truth, from justice, and from the courage to stand together against the dark. The world is full of broken things, broken hearts, broken lives, broken people. But sometimes, if you're brave enough, two broken pieces can fit together to make something stronger and more beautiful than ever before. If you believe in that kind of justice and that kind of love, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories that remind us that even in the deepest darkness, there's always a dawn waiting. We'll see you next time.